What's poppin', Sixers fans? This is the Sixers Talk podcast presented to you by Wilmington University. WilMU Works. I'm Ben Berry. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram. I am Ben Berry. I'm joined by the one, the only, the greatest at NBC Sports Philadelphia. Amy Fadol might have an argument, but Noah Levick. Noah, how you doing today?
I was actually starting to get on board because I thought you were going to introduce me as Amy, and she would have a great claim to the greatest title. Doing all right. As we've said a few times, most folks in the world are doing better than the Sixers. So not a pretty game last night. Ugly in many aspects, and they will be back at it again in about 24 hours. So that's probably the one major legitimate silver lining for this team after they lost to the Detroit Pistons last night.
Yeah, so they'll get a palate cleanser soon, ASAP. Before we get in the game, we should do a power rankings of people in the office, like who's most beloved by the city, not coworkers. I don't want anyone's feelings to be hurt because I'm going to be dead last. But yes, we're going to get into that, the game, how it just left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. 6 games away from the start of the playoffs, the jockeying for position in the Eastern Conference, since all 10 playoff teams are set for the playoffs and the playoff game. It's just who's going to end up where at this point. But we'll start off with what captured headlines, and whether we'll see if we're making too much out of this or if media's making too much out of this. Doc Rivers' post-game comments, where he was asked about the bench, and he thought that they played fine. He put the blame on James Harden. Do you think that was right? Do you think it's being made too much of it, or is being blown out of proportion? What do you make of it?
I think absolutely blown out of proportion. So he was asked about the bench struggling, and just to read the exact quote here, well, they didn't struggle. They didn't get a lot of shots in their defense. I think during that stretch, it was more James than them. Just a tough night. So a pretty short soundbite. Just the tone of it wasn't as if he was trying to say something highly critical or profound. He was frustrated after a really bad loss for his team. And I think just broadly trying to make the point of, okay, the bench got outscored 39-8, 21-0 in the first half, but a lot of those minutes with the second unit players are with James Harden, and he was taking and not making many of the shots. Harden 4 for 15 last night. And his play, I think, undeniably is one of the main reasons why the Sixers lost this game. So I didn't take it as I'm throwing James Harden under the bus, or I'm trying to use some sort of underhanded motivational tactic or anything especially significant. And, I trust the reads also of the folks there in Detroit. I saw Gina Mizell from the Inquirer, Kai Carlin, Sixers Wire, some of these folks on the beat who, traveled with the team for this game, had that same read of it. It just wasn't that big a deal, honestly. And I can understand Rivers' words being scrutinized and no one being happy with anything he has to say right now, and fairly not loving his explanations for a lot of the moves he's making basketball-wise. But just this particular thing, I didn't personally see it as the biggest deal in the world. I think the much larger concern, the much larger story is that some of the negative trends with the Sixers continued and got much worse last night. And that sort of performance with 6 games left from a team that has championship ambitions is undeniably not what you want to see. So I think the on-court stuff to me is just bigger than Doc Rivers, wanting to say his bench wasn't that bad and noting that James Harden took and missed a lot of shots when bench players were on the floor.
I like how you put all that, and we're going to get into a lot of things you just went over. My takeaway from Doc Rivers' comments on James Harden, I thought he was just holding him accountable. I didn't think it was too different than, and maybe too different than what he said about Ben Simmons after Game 7 last year. And the difference between those is one was after playoffs where the city, fans, and the team just lost, and a lot of people felt like the team was throwing Ben under the bus. I felt like the team was say this would happen and held him accountable. I didn't think it was any different last night from Doc after they lost to the Pistons. And I mean, unfortunately, James Harden has not played that well recent. In the last 6 games, his fourth quarters, he's 4 of 19, 2 from 10 from beyond the arc, 8 turnovers. He's minus 31 from the floor. That's just not good. And so I didn't think it was putting it all on James by any means, and I do think people are blowing it out of proportion. I just thought it was Doc Rivers saying, hey, you got to play better. That was my takeaway.
Right, and I don't think that's, just as was the case with Ben Simmons, I don't think that stance should be at all controversial. And I also just think if Rivers really intended to make some sort of grand critical statement here, he would have harped on the issue and would have, I think been a lot stronger in the language than just responding to the question and being defensive about his bench. I mean, the flip side of this is he could have taken the stance of, yeah, man, our second unit is just not giving us enough. And, Furkan made some boneheaded mistakes defensively. And, we can't have that from George with those bad turnovers. And he could have identified specific problems related to the bench players on his team. And I don't think folks would have looked upon that very kindly either. So I think just with his public comments at this point, he's often in a no-win situation. And that's understandable because the on-court product, wasn't good last night. And folks have concerns about this team's ability to win in the playoffs, his ability to lead them to deep playoff success. And, anything he says, people are going to find issue with it at this stage. So I think he gets that. I think everyone knows the reality here is he and the Sixers will be judged by what happens in the postseason. And if they make a great run and he's just money with all of his in-game moves, I think everyone's going to love what he has to say. But, that's obviously the opposite of where we sit right now.
Since the trade, the Sixers started off the trade for Harden 5-0. Since then, they've gone 1 for 5 in the last 6 games. James Harden, the Sixers are 1-4 when James Harden scores less than 20 points. I think there's a whole conversation that needs to be had there, just a deeper dive. Doc Rivers, he's damned if you do, damned if you don't position right now. I've been critical of him since he got hired here, when he was with the Clippers, when he was with the Celtics. I have my thoughts on Doc. And as you said, it's just he's in no-win situations. And that makes me think of the rumor that people in the organization was growing tired of Doc Rivers. I have all my Sixers friends that are anti-Doc. They were very excited to see that because they was like, oh, maybe we get a new coach in here. And I don't see that happen unless the Sixers completely bomb out in the playoffs, just completely flatline. I'm not putting too much weight to that report. It stinks that all this is coming up with 6 games left before the playoffs start.
Right. Yeah, I think, in any NBA locker room, it's rare to have unified support of the coach or just everyone loving the coach, maybe is a better way to put it. But absolutely, I think the Sixers, paid a healthy price to bring him in as Brett Brown's replacement, and have a high level of respect for his resume, even if many fans, like yourself, are on the same page and don't look at his resume as charitably. But I think Daryl Morey really likes Doc Rivers and, wanted him to, be his head coach in Houston briefly before both ended up here in Philadelphia. And it's always just been about the playoffs and the level of performance there. So, yeah, the Sixers aren't anywhere close to where they want to be late in the regular season. And I think the head coach falls under that same broad category. But if they do indeed figure stuff out in the playoffs and Harden is great and weeds out some of these abysmal shooting performances, and Rivers actually, makes the right moves with his rotations, all this, I think, becomes a lot less relevant, and just there's no really reason to care that much, right, about a couple players on the roster maybe, having some criticisms of their head coach if said roster is winning a bunch of playoff games. That's just kind of how this business works. But yeah, the vibes and the situation overall here with this team is not great, and they recognize their time to get all of that in a better spot is running out here. 6 games left, and then it gets real. Harden's used that phrase a few times, and it comes to mind now because just all this time to acclimate and integrate and kind of just trend in a better direction. It feels a lot more intense now. We're really getting close, and then it's going to matter, and all the criticism and scrutiny will amp up even more.
Yeah, it's a lot of these things is because the Sixers are just losing to the Pistons, who are, I think, the second worst team in the league, or maybe just the Eastern Conference. Either way, a really bad team. Shout out to Cade Cunningham, who's looking like he's just fully growing into the superstar that a lot of people thought he was. When I saw him play earlier in the season, you saw the talent, but you saw that he still had steps to go. Last night, it looks like he's going to be on his way soon. But back to Doc Rivers. If the Sixers are winning, a lot of these things aren't coming out or probably aren't being public. But since they're losing, it's low-hanging fruit for conversation. And I don't know, maybe I fell victim, and now that's why we're talking about it here. But me and Noah, we're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll come back, talk Tyrese Maxey, his plus-minus numbers, just adjustments we want to see from the Sixers after the game against the Pistons and this last stretch before the playoffs start. Start college, build skills, and complete your degree with Wilmington University. 100% online options and affordable tuition makes WilMU work for you. Learn more at wilmu.edu. We started off the pod, Noah, talking about Doc Rivers and not blaming the bench, but calling out James Harden. You and me both thought he was just keeping his players accountable, but the bench has not looked good. It's like a horror movie. The same things happen no matter what horror movie you see. It keeps happening. Sixers bench, no matter what game it is, they're getting outscored, and it just does not look good. Last night against the Pistons, they got outscored 29-8.
I think it was 39-8. Yeah.
Oh, 39-8. I apologize. Even worse. Noah, what can the Sixers do to solve this problem?
I'm not sure there are any great available answers. I think clearly they haven't settled on the rotations, just even at a basic level. So heading in, Doc Rivers previewed this as we want to try out some duos. So initially that was Harden and Harris sharing the floor for significant stints, and then Embiid and Maxey. Sixers went away from that for a while. Then they were back in that with that mode last night. Obviously was ineffective. And DeAndre Jordan was back in the mix after the Paul Millsap minutes were, an unqualified failure against the Milwaukee Bucks. And DeAndre Jordan, the Sixers got outscored by 9 points in his 10 minutes. And I do feel like it's necessary to note every time he has an ugly number along those lines, it's not just DeAndre Jordan. Like I mentioned, George Niang came out flat and sloppy in his first stint, which is rare for him. Usually consistent and on the ball, but didn't start the game well. And Furkan Korkmaz got his first crack in a few games, and that was disastrous. He got beaten for a backdoor layup almost before you saw that he was on the court, and he was just constantly trailing the play against Frank Jackson and didn't look equipped to be in that game defensively, and then didn't appear in the second half of it. So I think the players around DeAndre Jordan aren't doing the bench in general any favors. And then, as we touched on earlier, a lot of this ultimately seems to boil down to just, is Harden making step back threes? Is Harden drawing fouls? Is Harden making the guys around him better offensively? Is he being aggressive and scoring efficiently? He wasn't doing that stuff last night, and that's putting it mildly. So it was a confluence of negative factors that contributed to the especially terrible bench scoring disparity. And with that said, though, I don't think you can have a great degree of confidence in the second unit players in general and in Rivers's ability to actually hone in on what's effective. And it's a shame because you look at the starters just in isolation, and the net rating when those five guys share the court is about plus 19 per cleaning the glass, which is superb. So I think we now see that it's just everything besides that is the problem. Figuring out actually what lineups here might be effective, and but there are obviously big personnel weaknesses to work around, and the backup center spot is one of them. Paul Reed continues to be on the bench, and DeAndre Jordan, when he's in the game, the Sixers continue to look very shaky, both because of who he is at 33 years old and his lack of mobility, and all of the ways that he has dropped off as a player, and then also because the guys around him are not performing well and not gelling for the Sixers.
When you said Niang had a bad game, I thought to a article I read, the Philly Voice, and their observations after the game, and it was just George Niang played bad. Nothing else. It was nothing else. It seemed like he contributed. But no, so many things. The ball movement since before the James Harden trade, the team moved the ball very well. There wasn't, unless it was Embiid in the post or Embiid just, cooking, the ball moved around a lot since James Harden's gotten here. At first, it was a lot of great ball movement, but I would say over the last 6 games or so, it's a bunch of standing watching James Harden pound the ball either at the top of the key to get a three or drive in. And yes, him and Joel Embiid do the pick and roll, and they generate a lot of offense that way. But there's just, regardless, there's not a lot of ball movement, and I would like to know why. It seems like it's sticking to one of those two's hand, and everyone else is just waiting, reminiscent of Harden and Houston, waiting to get a look at a corner three. It just hasn't been working. Matisse Thybulle, we have credited him a lot for his defensive capabilities and his intelligence. I talked about Cade Cunningham right before we went to commercial break. Cade Cunningham was cooking him last night. I would say that's not a big problem, but it's just another observation I made. And back to the offense, just ball sticking and pounding. This falls on Doc Rivers and all the coaches and just everyone that is on the sidelines for the games to find another way to generate offense, because at this current rate, it's not working against the Pistons. It hasn't been working very well lately. If that's the offense that we'll do in a 7-game playoff series, it'll be a quick exit.
Sure looks that way. I think the Sixers showed promise in the early Harden days with pace and transition offense and just like getting easy points. And that hasn't really been there. And the half-court possessions, it is becoming more and more apparent that those tend to be quite deliberate and quite reliant on the individual stars just making something happen. And when those stars aren't hitting shots that they often do, which has been the case, with Harden's inconsistency, then you get 94 points against the Detroit Pistons and 15 points in that fourth quarter, and all of the many issues, that were present in last night's game. Detroit, continued this trend of switching the Embiid Harden pick and roll. And I think we continue to see that is a work in progress. There were instances where it looked simple and easy, right? Like, okay, they switched it. So boom, get Embiid the ball against, Sadiq Bey at the nail. He's 5 inches taller than him and a lot stronger, and just let Embiid do his thing and bowl his way to the basket. Harden, makes a step back three against a big guy. Great. That should be there often. But just some of the nuances and decisiveness, I think you see it's lacking, both in how the Sixers attack the pick and roll switches, and then just in general. The Pistons even surprised them a few times with double teams when the Sixers got a mismatch that they liked, but then Harden was pounding the ball and Detroit sent an extra defender and the Sixers didn't respond to that well. Or there was a play where Embiid was backing down Corey Joseph, and you thought, okay, great, Embiid's going to get his way into the paint and produce something against a much smaller player. But then Bey double teams, Embiid doesn't see him coming, no one communicates that to him, and the Pistons get a steal and I believe an ensuing fast break bucket. So the offense, I think on paper, the notion that two great scorers in isolation and on post-ups respectively with Harden and Embiid, you figure that that's going to be productive, but actually putting that into practice and adjusting effectively within games to how opponents are guarding you, clearly that's not working to perfection. But again, I think if you zoom out, when Embiid and Harden are on the court and when the starters are on the court, the Sixers have been outscoring teams by a lot of points. The problem is when the Sixers turn away from their starters, that things have gone quite badly for the team, and the leads dwindle, and the team loses momentum, and losses result from that. I thought last night was a great example just of the issues without Embiid kind of bleeding into when he checked back into that game. The Pistons cut the Sixers lead to, I believe, 1 point with 6 or 7 minutes left in that fourth quarter. And again, on paper, if you're the Sixers, you think, great, we're leading the Pistons by a point and we've got our best lineup on the floor. But Detroit had all the momentum. The Sixers, I think, were frustrated and unhappy with the way the bench put them in a position where that game was very competitive. And then the starters, of course, didn't get the job done, to put it mildly, down the stretch.
Ooh, that was a lot. Thanks. That's good stuff right there. That's good stuff right there, Noah. One little tidbit I wanted to point out before we move on just to the standings before we get out of here. Tyrese Maxey, over the last several games, the Sixers are minus 39 when he's on the floor and plus 19 when he's off the floor. What I found that shocking and wild. I know I just sprung that on you. So when you hear that, what comes to mind?
I think first, so I think last night he was 5 for 10 from the floor, but I believe the 3 games prior he was in the low 30s with field goal percentage. So part of it is just he's missing shots that he'd been hitting, and of course, any player is better when they're shooting a higher field goal percentage. And then I think the second thing that comes to mind is the inconsistency with who he's playing with, and the inability to develop chemistry and familiarity to the extent that would be ideal. And then I guess the third thing that comes to mind is, as Rivers has rather bluntly noted a few times, like, he's not where the Sixers would like him to be defensively. That's not to say the effort is poor or that he doesn't have encouraging flashes, but he's, not a player the team has a ton of confidence in on the defensive end, and that is sometimes problematic. Just rewatching the ugliness down the stretch last night, there's a play where part of the problem is just the Sixers clearly not communicating and just not being sharp as a 5-man unit. But, Maxey just doesn't do what he needs to as far as getting through a dribble handoff, and his man penetrates, and that exposes the rest of the Sixers defense, leads to a Detroit 3. That's not to nitpick him and say he's the only one who was subpar defensively in the fourth quarter of that game, but he has some physical, realities he's got to work around as a smaller guard. And then also he needs to be, I think, sharp with the other details and recognize that he's still viewed as a young player that other teams will try to target on defense. But look, I think every player has ups and downs with plus minus, and that's obviously not an end-all be-all stat. There are a lot of other ways to assess a player, and we're talking about a small sample size, and he'd been really great before that. So maybe he was due for a little bit of a drop-off. I still think yeah.
He's a young player, second-year player. He's still plus 155 for the season, according to StatMuse.com. So I'm not I'm not too worried about it. It was eye-popping when I saw it.
Yeah, it is interesting. And you get, I think, little oddities with the plus minus over small sample sizes like that. So yeah, definitely don't want to read a ton into it, but I think it does match what you see overall, that his play had not been a positive for the Sixers over the last 4 or 5 games. And also just that he hasn't gotten a ton of opportunities to, be Tyrese Maxey. And part of that's the lack of transition, chances that I mentioned. Part of it's just the Sixers running everything through Joel Embiid and James Harden, and Maxey not getting a ton of situations in which he's like the guy on the court, and in that role where he's asked to take over. So, the Sixers would love if he could bounce back a little bit and add a 20, 25 point performance, back on that game log down the stretch here.
All right, Noah, before we get out of here, just want to read over these Eastern Conference standings for you. So as of April 1st, Heat 1 seed, Bucks 2 seed, Celtics 3 seed, Sixers 4 seed, followed by the Bulls and Raptors 5 and 6. The Cavaliers, Nets, Hornets, and the Hawks are in the play-in as of right now. Those are the only teams making the playoffs. Everyone else is eliminated at this point in the East. The Knicks, the Wizards, the Pacers. Where do you see the Sixers in 6 more games? How do you see this playing out for the Sixers? Are you comfortable with them being the 4 seed, move a little higher, or are you just more? It's more important for them to figure out these things they need to work on, whether it's the rotation, ball movement on the offense, transition defense. What do you want to see these last 6 games?
I think both categories matter a lot. I think health continues to be ultra important. We didn't mention it, but there was another James Harden injury scare in this game where he collides with Cunningham in the third quarter and was moving gingerly and seemed to potentially have a groin issue, which, your mind starts wandering to that potentially being the kind of thing that sidelines players for a significant period. So there's great uncertainty with the Stars' health, and they still got to get through 6 more games and reach the playoffs healthy. I agree, though, that just the team playing better basketball needs to happen. Like, you play like you did last night against Detroit, the playoffs are not going to last very long. But the matchups, as we've talked about a million times, are also paramount. And I think, ironically, like, if the season ended today, the matchups would actually be decent from the Sixers' perspective. They swept the Bulls, and Embiid, I think, looked especially dominant against them. And then the potential second round matchup there would be the Miami Heat, who the Sixers just earned a really, encouraging win against, in a shorthanded spot. So not to say that any second round opponent here would be easy or that the Sixers should have a great level of confidence that they will be advancing beyond the second round. But that's actually probably not a bad draw. But of course, if the Sixers end up in the 4 spot and the way they get there is finishing this regular season 1-5 and Harden's playing badly and all of these problems that were apparent in Detroit, remain, I don't think you feel very good about the state of the team. But a matchup with the Chicago Bulls in the first round, just that in isolation, like, yeah, that's not a bad way for this to play out for the Sixers if that is indeed who they draw in round 1.
These last 6 games, I want them to figure out this offensive ball movement and the rotation. That everything would be nice, getting back on a winning record or winning track, transition defense, but offensive ball movement and just the rotation, because it's just been so bad the last couple of games. Staying in a 4 seed in the East isn't the worst thing in the world. And as you said, the matchup with the Bulls, I would like that for the first round of the playoffs. Last 6 games, they only have 2 playoff teams on their on their schedule. That is the Cavs and the Raptors. Hornets, Cavs this weekend, Pacers Tuesday, Raptors next Thursday. The next weekend, the Pacers and Detroit again. Just see good winning basketball, solve the offensive ball movement and rotation. That's what I'm hoping for out of Doc Rivers and the Sixers. Noah, before we get out of here, any last things? Anything you're working on the website? Anything you're doing fun this weekend?
No, the main item on the agenda is now 23 hours or so away from the Sixers-Hornets tip-off, the rare afternoon game, which I don't mind at all, personally. I think I've said it before, the Sixers have bounced back well in a broad sense this season when the losses are especially disheartening or discouraging. And, last night, obviously, I think was a low point in the brief James Harden era. So they need to make that happen again. And I don't think it's beyond them from a personnel talent standpoint. But I fully understand fans not having a lot of faith right now and just not believing that this coach and this team can get beyond the second round of the playoffs. This is a bleak time, to be a fan of this team relative to what you talked about. With it started out so great with Harden and 5-0, and it's really gone downhill. But we're not anywhere near done. There's a lot of time left, and they've got to find answers. The pressure's on to do so. I'll just finally note, I thought Embiid had interesting perspective, talking to reporters in Detroit last night about the last time they made a major in-season move was that 2018-19 season with Jimmy Butler and Tobias Harris as well. And it didn't really click as far as what roles everyone should be in and how to best play together until the second rounds of the playoffs. Obviously, the Sixers would not want to replicate that result, a devastating Game 7 loss. But they're probably going to have to figure stuff out in the playoffs because there's only 6 regular season games left. But on the other hand, I do think it is valid to say talented players and teams can pull that off. And the Sixers, as brutal as things seem after last night, still have a lot of talent on this roster and still have the ability to turn this around. But it's going to take a turnaround at this point because the current state of affairs, is no one's happy. No one's happy with that right now. But this was the Sixers' first 3-game losing streak, I'll note, since December. So this hadn't happened in a while. And now it's on them to ensure it doesn't linger and the vibes improve and Doc Rivers post-game answers, do not draw as much ire because they're coming after victories.
Well, thank you, Sixers fans, for hanging out with us. Enjoy your weekend. He's Noah Levick. You can follow him on Twitter at Noah Levick. I'm Ben Berry. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram at I am Ben Berry. This was the Sixers Talk Podcast presented to you by Wilmington University. Wilmu Works.